Hi, it's Katrina. Have you ever wondered what secrets ancient civilizations left behind? Today, I'm going to share some amazing forgotten cities from before the flood, a lost kingdom, and even a Maya palace that was just discovered after 1,000 years. So get ready and let's see if we find some answers or just uncover more questions. Ancient Maya Palace. An epic palace like you won't believe has just been found in the jungle of Mexico. Researchers found the immense structure near the popular city of Cancun, where most people go to enjoy the beach and a margarita. What tourists don't know is that just outside the resort strip is the city of Kuluba, last used by the Maya 1,000 years ago. The palace found here is enormous. Its ruins stand 20 feet tall and over 180 feet long. Archaeologist Alfredo Barrera helped unveil the palace during a recent dig in the ruined city. He says researchers have just begun to uncover its full scope. There are still so many ancient secrets to investigate. If you've been to Cancun, you may have visited the Maya cities of Chichen Itza or Ekbalam. But Kuluba isn't on most tourist itineraries. This site was initially found by an American archaeologist named Willis Andrews IV in 1939. It dates to the earliest years of the Maya, around 250 BC. People started to flee the city around 800 AD, and about 200 years later, it was completely empty. Why everyone abandoned the city is unknown. Even the experts don't know who ruled Kuluba from the incredible palace that they just found. That's the crazy thing about the Maya. Each of those cities was like its own little kingdom, and each one has a story. But sadly, the story of Kuluba has been lost for more than a millennium. Forgotten cities of the pre-flood world. There was a world before the flood, a world of great technological advancements and high-tech civilizations. Have you ever heard of the Sumerian king list? If you've been around watching this channel for a while, you probably have. But just in case, the Sumerian king list is an ancient text listing the rulers of Mesopotamian cities. It seems to be a mix of real and mythological rulers, which can lead to some confusion, especially since some of the earlier kings reigned for thousands of years. But if the ancient Sumerian king list is to be believed, modern civilization in Mesopotamia began with the Kish dynasty, approximately 20,580 BC. Before that, the world was ruled for between 432,000 and 240,000 years by the gods themselves. But how can this be possible? The oldest archaeological site confirmed by mainstream scientists is Göbekli Tepe, just shy of 12,000 years old. Ancient astronaut theorists believe there might be more going on with ancient history than scientists are telling us. They are taking it as a literal document. The Egyptians have a similar list. Even the Bible has its old patriarchs who lived for centuries. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, civilizations around the world believed they were ruled by godlike beings with ridiculously long lifespans. These beings presumably belonged to a different civilization than the one that exists now. But is there more proof than just dusty old tablets? The proof lies in the very cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. There are 7 ancient cities associated with antediluvian kings on the Sumerian king list. There's Babylon, Bad Tibira, Eridu, Larak, Larsa, Shuruppak, and Sippar. In 1931, in the ruins of Shuruppak, archaeologists found evidence of flood damage between the 2 lowest layers of strata. In Sippar, archaeologists found records of a civilization that existed prior to the city being destroyed by floodwaters. You know how a lot of ancient sites are lined with certain cosmic events, like solstices and equinoxes? It's true in most places, but not in the city of Sippar. The Temple of Shamash, the ancient Mesopotamian sun god, and its accompanying ziggurat do not align with any current geographic poles. And neither does the temple of the sun god at Larsa or the palace at Eridu. Some of the most important buildings in the earliest cities on this planet do not align with anything we know of. But here's the juicy part I've been waiting to get to. The buildings used to align. The ancient palace at Eridu is aligned perfectly with where the North Pole was 130,000 years ago. Could these buildings be far older than archaeologists are saying? The alignment alone suggests the pyramids and towers of Mesopotamia, like the Tower of Babel, were built more than 100,000 years before Noah's flood. And now for a quick break because it's shoutout time! I want to give a huge thank you to Surprised Compass and Tiffany Culbertson for supporting this channel. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Great African Kingdom you've never heard of. Can you name the first state in Africa? I would guess 99% of people can't. It's called Mapungubwe, an Iron Age settlement from the 11th century. It was likely the first state in southern Africa, yet its history is lost. The kingdom of Mapungubwe didn't leave behind any written records. The only things researchers know about them have come from archaeological digs. Mapungubwe is the name of the civilization and their capital city, which is currently a ruin. Mapungubwe is a lump of broken stone houses and old walls in the midst of the South African savanna. You have to really use your imagination to picture what this place would have been like. Archaeologists don't know precisely when the kingdom got its start. Through excavations, they have found layers of bones from about the 9th century AD. There appear to have been cattle herds here, which brought wealth to the community. Excavations showed that after about 100 years, domesticated cattle numbers increased dramatically. Something happened that turned a small settlement of cattle herders into very wealthy people. Suddenly, they started building large stone enclosures. A king took power, building a rocky house at the highest level of the city on a sandstone hill. Archaeologists have found separate dwellings on the hill where they think the cattle king's many wives lived. What's amazing about Mapungubwe is how much archaeologists have pieced together with such little evidence. What you have here is a snapshot of a society developing over a span of only a century. Some people raised some cattle, they made some money, a king took over, and suddenly there was a monarch on a hill with multiple wives. How did the rest of the people live in Mapungubwe? Not as well as the king. Archaeologists have found most of the community lived in mud houses under the hill. There were about 5 hectares of mud shanties under the king's big stone castle, enough to maintain a population of about 5,000. Meanwhile, back up on the hill, archaeologists found a royal burial ground where the king and his predecessors were laid to rest. Commoners were buried nearby in a valley. So, what happened to what might have been southern Africa's first advanced state? It fell apart by the 13th century. Archaeologists think it was because of overpopulation. Too much stress was put on natural resources. The very materials that made the people of Mapungubwe rich through trade ran out, and when that happened, everybody abandoned ship. It's a story that archaeologists have seen time and time again, but there is one more thing that I think you should know, and be warned, it's disturbing. When Europeans discovered the ruins of Mapungubwe, they refused to believe the structures were built by Africans. It didn't even come to their minds. So the Europeans attributed Mapungubwe to the Phoenicians or the Egyptians. Science has proven that Mapungubwe was indeed built by Africans, but the whole thing goes to show what the attitude was like in the archaeological community just a century ago. Cannibalism in ancient Mexico. Eating humans is not very popular anymore. Let's all be thankful for that. But there were ancient civilizations who didn't mind dabbling in human cuisine, which, by the way, would be the worst episode of Hell's Kitchen ever. One such civilization was the Shishimes of Mexico. There have been rumors for decades that the isolated tribe in what is now northern Mexico feasted on their foes, possibly even their friends. But nobody could prove it until now. Scientists analyzed more than 3 dozen bodies in the old stomping ground of the Shishimes. The bodies showed evidence of boiling and defleshing. Sorry if I'm giving you nightmares, but that's the truth. Archaeologists say there is no doubt about it anymore. The Shishimes were cannibals. The rumor started with Jesuit missionaries a few centuries ago. The missionaries wrote about how the Shishimes believed that by eating the bodies of their enemies, they would have a better grain harvest. The Shishimes also thought if they ate one another and used the bones in rituals, it would boost their women's fertility rates. Archaeologist José Luis Punzo said the newly analyzed bones prove that cannibalism was a big aspect of their worldview. Everything the Shishimes did revolved around consuming other people. Imagine if that was all you were thinking about day and night. The Shishimes' entire world was blood, corn, and bones. Their annual planting and sowing cycle was directly tied to cannibalistic rituals. At each corn harvest, legions of Shishime warriors were sent out into the wild in search of victims. The warriors would kidnap men who were out working in their fields and nearby villages. The Shishimes would do whatever was necessary to get victims back to their main village. I won't gross you out with the gory details of what happened next. I'm sure your imagination can do the work. But who were these people outside of their bloodthirsty and barbaric rituals? They lived in the mountains of Durango State in the Middle Ages. At their peak, they likely didn't number more than 5,000. Of all the ancient indigenous groups in Mexico, only the Shishimes and Acashis are said to have been real practicing cannibals. The Aztec may have practiced brutal sacrifices, but they didn't habitually eat each other. There is so much more to Mexico's history than just the Aztec and the Maya. In the Durango Mountains, the Shishimes were a world apart from the country's most famous empires. The Shishimes battled members of other tribal groups. They also only ate people of their own ethnicity. They wouldn't eat men from other native groups or the Spanish colonizers when they showed up. The Europeans weren't worth the trouble of cooking. You might be wondering what happened to the Mexican cannibals. When the Spanish showed up, they fought back hard. They were first identified by Conquistador Nuño de Guzman in 1530. At first, the Shishimes tolerated the Spaniards moving closer to their territory, but by 1610, the resistance turned violent. The Shishimes believed the Jesuit churches were temples of disease. They thought that by destroying the churches, they would gain immortality. Alas, the Shishimes couldn't fight all of Spain on their own. They reached out to their cannibal neighbors for help, but the Acashis turned them down. Who would have thought that centuries of killing and eating their neighbors would leave the Shishimes without any friends? The Acashis went to the Spanish, asked for a truce, and fought with Spain against the Shishimes. And we kind of know how that ended for everyone. The mystery of the Jiroft. Nobody even knew the Jiroft culture existed until the 21st century. In 2001, there was a flash flood in Iran. When the floodwater was gone, locals were shocked to see bits of ruined structures poking out from the sandy landscape. The stone buildings were part of a city, one that thrived 5,000 years ago. This mighty city was buried under one of the hottest places in Iran. Over the last 20 years, archaeologists have been trying to figure out what there is to know about Jiroft and its ancient inhabitants. The craziest mystery has been the manuscripts. Clay tablets have been uncovered in the ruins of Jiroft that could predate everything discovered in the rest of Mesopotamia. It's absolutely nuts! You'll often hear that cuneiform writing is the oldest form of writing in the world, created by the Sumerians. But the texts at Jiroft could be even older. Scientists have named the mysterious script Elamite. Here's where things get a little complicated. The Elamite language existed in Iran from roughly 5,000 years ago until 330 BC. It was used in the cradle of civilization up until the conquest of Alexander the Great. After Alexander the Great entered Iran, Elamite disappeared from the archaeological record. He clearly had something to do with the loss of this ancient language. There are a few different types of Elamite. There's Elamite cuneiform, a sophisticated language using about 130 glyphs. There are more than 20,000 tablets with this script on it. Going backward in time, there is an older version called Linear Elamite. Then there is the super ancient version found in Jiroft. It's believed the Jiroft script is called Proto-Elamite. It consists of over 1,000 signs and has never been deciphered by anyone. The Proto-Elamite manuscripts could contain secrets of the universe. These could be scripts written by people who lived when the Anunnaki were still on Earth. The true history of humans could be locked away in these bizarre signs and sigils that nobody can read. Jiroft is an enigma buried under the sand. Researchers believe they have found the earliest evidence for a ziggurat in Jiroft, which is the earliest type of pyramid. Archaeologists have also found statues, strange animal figures, and stone objects. They have uncovered brick ramparts 36 feet thick, suggesting a massive defensive wall. But for all of their research, what archaeologists want most of all is to crack the Proto-Elamite code. The Irish Olympics. Everything you thought you knew about the Olympics is wrong. The Greeks have been given credit for a lot of inventions, from automatic doors to computers. For as long as anyone can remember, the Greeks have been recognized for creating the world's first sporting games. But that's just not true. Yes, the Olympic Games were real. They were held in the city of Olympia from 776 BC until 393 AD. Then the Games stopped for 1,500 years, only kicking off again in 1896. It's pretty amazing to think that after such a long absence, the Games made a huge comeback and are still popular right now. There's more to the story though. Heroes and athletes competed for glory in a much older game in Ireland. 1,000 years before the first Greek Games at Olympia, the Tailteann Games were held in Ireland's County Meath. I'd like to introduce you to Renee Clark. She has lived on the banks of the River Blackwater in County Meath for the last 2 decades. The home she lives in is run as a bed and breakfast. It is smack dab in the center of a prehistoric landscape. Her house is surrounded by an ancient cemetery and examples of rock art from 4,000 years ago. Renee claims her house is standing on the very spot where the Tailteann Games first took place. Renee even claimed the Greeks got their inspiration for the Olympics from the Celtic sporting event. It's hard to know what to believe. According to legend, the Greek city of Olympia was home to the cult of Zeus. It was where the Greek god was worshipped most intensely, starting around the 10th century BC. The Olympic Games were started in his honor. Coincidentally, Renee Clark's home is associated with the ancient Irish goddess Tailteann, queen of the Tuatha De Danann. Legend has it that when the queen died, she was buried by her son in County Meath. The grieving son founded the Tailteann Games in honor of his mother, and this was around the 18th century BC. The Irish Games were very real and lasted even longer than the Olympics. They were played every year in July up until the Norman invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. The Games didn't make a comeback until 1924 after the Irish Civil War. Men dressed as Gaelic warriors went out before the roaring Irish crowd. However, the Tailteann Games never quite took off quite like the Olympics did. How would you like to see the Tailteann Games brought back? Do you really think the Greeks copied the Irish? Let me know in the comments below. Easter Island mystery finally solved. Scientists still can't figure out what is going on with Easter Island. The debate rages on even as new archaeological research disproves one of the most famous narratives. I think we need to get to the bottom of what went wrong with the Easter Island civilization. How did it collapse? It used to be that everyone believed Easter Island was a cautionary tale of overindulgence. The idea was that the civilization on the island collapsed because they destroyed their own ecosystem. They removed all the trees, ate all the animals, and used all of their resources to build their statues. With nothing left, the whole society collapsed in on itself. New research has refuted this previously accepted scientific theory. A recent archaeological investigation showed that the island's population never plummeted at all. There was no collapse on Easter Island. Everything you thought is real is a lie. Well, maybe. There was a collapse, but it didn't happen in ancient times. New proof shows that the island's population remained perfectly fine up until the 19th century. Can you guess who showed up in the 19th century? That's right, it was the European colonizers. The people of Easter Island did indeed have resources. Scientists found they could keep a stable population thanks to advanced techniques that were able to maximize food production. Scholars from 3 American universities identified places on the island that yield a surprising number of crops. It's believed the Easter Island culture brought the techniques with them from wherever they were before. When they arrived on the island around 1200 AD, they used something called rock mulching to enhance the natural soil. Rock mulching is grinding up rocks into the soil, something that sounds silly but totally works. As for the original people who landed on Easter Island, they were of Polynesian descent. I like to think of the Polynesians as intergalactic travelers, with the Pacific Ocean being the universe. They left their home planet, aka their origin island, and populated hundreds of remote islands in the Pacific. They were just like seed ships in the future, populating different worlds. Only instead of spaceships, Polynesian explorers used catamarans, the wind, and the stars to find new lands. Easter Island is unique because of how isolated it is from every other human settlement. It is 2,200 miles from a significant landmass. It's 1,150 miles from the nearest small island. It's no wonder the Polynesians who settled it evolved their own unique culture. They became known as the Rapa Nui, which also happens to be the real name of Easter Island. They worshipped their ancestors like gods, which is why they built the giant stone statues known as moai. Some of the statues are more than 30 feet tall and almost 100 tons. After they arrived on the island, they got to work terraforming it. They chopped down almost all the trees, turned 1% of farmable land into lush gardens, and cultivated delicious food. Food like yams, bananas, and sugarcane. They also had chickens and rats. Everyone loves rat, chicken, banana soup. By 1860, about 95% of the Rapa Nui population was gone. Historians blamed the massive loss of life on them not knowing how to take care of their island. But the truth is that they perished from European diseases, slavery, and violence. British businessmen took control of the island as the Rapa Nui numbers plummeted. They turned it into a ranch with 50,000 sheep on it. People have been trying to find an explanation for why Rapa Nui fell apart, but the answer has been there all along. This new study, co-authored by American archaeologist Dylan Davis from Columbia University, has disproved the ecocide theory. The islanders were either killed or forced to leave. But I do have good news. Everything isn't doom and gloom. Over the past 130 years, the indigenous population has recovered. Out of the 7,800 people now living on the island, 45% are indigenous. There is still one mystery that's yet to be solved. So much damage was done to the island that none of the living indigenous people know how to read their ancient writing system. The full story of Rapa Nui is written on wood tablets in the Rongo Rongo script, but nobody can read it. How high were they? Ancient people used to get high. Throughout history, the use of drugs has been a permanent fixture. As far back as 9,000 BC, indigenous people in the Americas were eating mushrooms and taking mescaline to go on wild hallucinogenic trips through space and time. For the Maya, the Aztec, and the Olmec, psychoactive substances were typically used in religious ceremonies. In ancient China and ancient Egypt, they used cannabis in their rituals. 7,000 years ago, in Sumerian cities, opium was the drug of choice. But this is all stuff you might already know. Let's check out some substances used by ancient civilizations that you may not have heard of before. For example, harmal. Harmal is an ancient flowering plant that can be distilled to make the chemical harmine. Harmine can then be used as an antidepressant. It doesn't just help with depression, but also creates intense hallucinations. People in Iran and West India, and also on the other side of the world in the Andes Mountains, used harmal frequently. It's been found buried with mummies in northern Chile from around 1,200 years ago. One mummy was found buried with a snuffing tray and some pipes that were used for consuming the drug. I guess he must have been really depressed. One of the drugs used by ancient people might be sitting in your cupboard right now. Nutmeg is a standard ingredient in today's cooking, but it can also be used as a sedative and to help treat asthma and heart conditions. Ancient cultures thought nutmeg had magical powers, typically in India and Asia. Have you heard of blue lotus before? It was one of the most popular substances of ancient Egypt. I won't tell you explicitly which drug this was like, but I'll name some symptoms and let you draw your own conclusions. When Egyptians took blue lotus, they were more talkative, more confident, and a little more alert. But prolonged use caused mental fatigue. In Homer's epic poem The Odyssey, the hero Odysseus consumed blue lotus and lost his motivation. He didn't want to fight the Greek gods anymore, or even continue his journey home to Ithaca. He just wanted to sit around and chillax. Ancient people relied on these drugs as medicine for religion and rituals and possible recreational use. Certain substances were believed to bridge the gap between the human world and the gods. The Island King's last stronghold. There was once a king who was so divine that his feet were never allowed to touch the ground. If you can guess his name before I say it, I'll be super impressed. One empire you don't hear enough about these days is the Empire of Tonga, or the Tu'i Tonga. In the 10th century, people living on the small remote island in the Pacific Ocean got really motivated. They started sending ships to neighboring islands to populate them. Soon, the Empire of Tonga had spread far from their original home island. This long period of expansion lasted nearly 5 centuries. Around 1450 AD, it started coming to a close. That was when the huge stone fortifications of Taliatumu on Wallis Island were built. They still stand today with these short stone walls surrounding an abandoned ceremonial platform. All around the platform is a raised stone walkway. The walkway was reserved for the king, who, unlike mere mortals, was not allowed to touch the ground. Have you guessed the king's name? If you have, then I'm going to be shocked because I don't even know it. The specific details of the South Pacific Island kings have been lost for centuries. Only a few of their names remain in the history books, like King Takalawa, last of the great Tongan emperors. It's believed he was assassinated in 1535 in the city of Mua, the old Tonga capital. Researchers think Taliatumu may have been one of the last strongholds of the Tongans when their defeat was imminent. Their islands fell one by one, and the last bastion of safety was at Taliatumu. When it too fell in the 17th century, the site was neglected for years until the 1990s, when French archaeologists arrived and restored it. The secrets of the Acropolis. The Acropolis of Athens looms above the Greek capital as one of the most recognizable citadels in the world. It's 490 feet above sea level, visible no matter where you are in the city. But there is more to the Acropolis than just the Parthenon. Its history goes back to the Neolithic days. Evidence has been found that the Acropolis was occupied by humans as early as 8,000 years ago. It has been a sacred place for as long as humans have lived in Athens. During antiquity, the Athenians called the Acropolis the Cecropia, named after the legendary serpent king Cecrops, first ruler of Athens. The most famous building at the Acropolis is the Parthenon, a mighty temple dedicated to Athena, patron goddess of Athens and Greek deity of wisdom. This thing can also be seen from almost anywhere in the city. What few people realize is that there is something buried underneath the Parthenon. Nobody knows precisely what it is, but it's definitely under there. A piece of ancient graffiti is helping scientists get to the bottom of it. A small piece of graffiti was found on a marble outcrop about 13 miles from Athens. There are way more examples of ancient graffiti around than you might think. Graffiti was usually made by shepherds and goat herders, people who got bored who doodled on stone. The art varies from pictures of ships and images of horses to scenes of erotica. These drawings date to the 6th century BC, before the Parthenon was built. One of the doodles struck researcher Merle Langdon as suspicious. Somebody drew the rough outline of a building that looks a lot like a temple. The piece of graffiti has the word hekatompedon. The word means 100-footer, alluding to a really big building. Merle believes the doodle could represent a much older temple that stood where the Parthenon stands today. A huge temple, 100 steps long at least. This is exciting because scientists have never been able to agree on what originally stood on the Acropolis. There was definitely something, but what? In 480 BC, the Persian army went to Athens and destroyed almost everything that stood on the Acropolis. Historians are pretty sure there was a sanctuary called Ekatompedon that was lost, but everything else is a matter of speculation. There are no reliable records. After the Persians left in the 5th century BC, the great leader Pericles initiated a bunch of construction projects. It was during this golden age of Greece that the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena Nike, Apollonia, and other monuments on the Acropolis were built. The buried secret under the Parthenon may never truly be revealed. The original temple of the Athenians might remain as nothing more than a sheep herder's doodle on a chunk of stone. The Garden Civilization of the Amazon. Traces of an Amazonian civilization have been found in the Amazon, but the civilization is so old it predates all other known Amazonian societies. This mysterious culture lived in what archaeologists have called a unique form of garden urbanism. The incredible civilization was centered in Ecuador's Upano Valley. Researchers didn't just find a few old buildings or some ruins, they identified over 6,000 earthen platforms. These platforms were used like concrete foundation blocks for houses and communal buildings. They were identified in 15 clumps, likely representing 15 urban centers. Outside each concentration of platforms are the remnants of what appeared to be farms and highways. The highways were part of a vast road network connecting the farms to the urban centers, just like how any modern country is connected by highways and interstates. Stephen Rostein from the French National Center for Scientific Research said this is the oldest civilization of its kind found in the area. There is no equivalent anywhere else in Amazonia. The nearest ancient city with a comparable urban layout is thousands of miles north in Maya territory. The ancient garden cities are at least 2,500 years old. Scientists know it because they have already excavated some of the earthen platforms. They uncovered the remains of houses that were built around 500 BC. That was 200 years before Alexander the Great's invasion of Iran. Not every settlement found in Ecuador was huge. Some were small, consisting of only a couple houses and a few platforms. But some were enormous, with each platform the size of Central Park in New York City. The greatest mystery isn't where the people came from or why they disappeared without a trace. The greatest mystery is what life was like. And what were these mounds for? Ceremonies, parties, ancient concerts? How many people called the Upano Valley home? What gods did they worship? Scientists know absolutely nothing about the Garden civilization, their beliefs, their origins, or their ultimate demise. Evidence shows that their cities were abandoned around 300 AD, but there is no indication of why. What do you think happened to the mighty civilization of Amazonia? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching! Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and if you want to see more content, stick around for an older video you might have missed.
King Montezuma. King Montezuma had the extreme misfortune of being king of the Aztec when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés showed up in 1519. History has a strange way of changing narratives. According to the Spanish, King Montezuma immediately surrendered because he recognized the divine right of the Catholic Church. He supposedly understood that the Spanish people were permitted by God to occupy his lands and subjugate his citizens. But of course, that never happened at all. That was 16th century Spanish propaganda to justify the invasion and genocide that took place in the Aztec Empire. The truth is that Montezuma was a powerful leader. According to historian Buddy Levy, Montezuma was named king of Tenochtitlan in the year 1502. He was a respected military leader, and he grew the economy and status of the Aztec Empire within just a few short years. Even as the Aztecs suffered 3 years of brutal famine and multiple earthquakes, they prospered. When Cortés arrived in the capital of the Aztec, Montezuma kept a close watch on him. He had spies follow the Spanish around, and as Cortés plotted the destruction of the Aztec, Montezuma was plotting as well. But then, things took a nasty turn. Montezuma was captured and humiliated by the small Spanish force and made to hand over a huge chunk of gold. When Montezuma next faced his people, they were so furious at his weakness that they threw rocks at him and killed him. Juana of Castile. Juana of Castile, known more plainly as Juana la Loca or Joan the Mad, was the Queen of Castile from 1504 and the Queen of Aragon from 1517 up until the time of her death. She was never supposed to wear a crown, and only did because of so many deaths in the family that happened in rapid succession. Most of the power was exercised for her by her father, Ferdinand II, her husband, Philip I, and her son, who became Emperor Charles V. As the third child, and a daughter at that, she was not meant to rule really, but to be married to an ally to protect Spain against France. Her brother died in 1497, followed by her older sister Isabella in 1498 after giving birth, and then her nephew passed away in 1500. These unfortunate events left her as the only heir to the throne, and when her mother died in 1504, she became queen. She was married to Philip of Burgundy, son of the Emperor Maximilian I. He was king of the Netherlands and later king consort of Spain. While her family and connections were the most powerful in Europe, she didn't have much of an effect on politics and was always at the mercy of the arguments between her husband and her father. Even though she was the queen of one of the largest kingdoms in Europe, she was deemed mentally insane, and the many deaths in her family, as well as her husband's infidelity, may have pushed her over the edge. Historians believe she may have suffered from depression, schizophrenia, bouts of jealousy, and it's hard to know what was the truth and what was the result of her husband, who locked her up and provoked her. He wanted to make her look incompetent so that he could take the throne instead. But Philip the Handsome died at the age of 28, and she wound up confined inside the royal convent of Santa Clara by her father, King Ferdinand II, until he died in 1516. Her son became one of the most powerful people in the world and inherited the thrones of Castile, Aragon, and the Duchy of Burgundy, as well as the Habsburg realms in Central Europe. He kept his mother locked up and refused her any visitors. While Juana was powerful by name and bloodline, her life was not so great. However, all of her children were highly successful, and her daughters went on to become queens all over Europe. She was the mother of the most powerful people of the day, Tiberius. Roman Emperor Tiberius ruled over Rome from between the years 14 and 37 BC. He was the adopted son of the far more famous Emperor Caesar Augustus. He never really wanted to become a vicious warlord like his dad, but his controlling mother Livia forced him into it. Tiberius never even wanted to be emperor. He enjoyed life prior to being forced into the political arena. He was a great general, he held a governorship in Gaul, and things were better for Tiberius out of the spotlight. But when it came to being emperor, he just didn't have a choice. His first few years ruling the entirety of the Roman Empire weren't great. That was in part because he gave much authority to the Senate. He wasn't interested in being overlord of everything, even though he could have been, and so he let the Senate work out most of the bureaucracy. Tiberius was such a lazy emperor that he didn't even finish most of the public works projects he started, and they weren't completed until much later by other emperors. Tiberius had an adopted son named Germanicus Julius, who most believed would have made a much better emperor. Sadly, Germanicus died after contracting an illness in the year 18. Following his adopted son's death, Tiberius grew strange. Between the years 18 and 26 AD, he tortured slaves and became wrathful against all of those who would oppose him. It eventually grew too much for him. He exiled himself to the Isle of Capri because being the Roman emperor had just proved too stressful. He stayed on the island until the year 37, when he died at 77 years old. Rollo, the greatest Viking. Rollo the Walker came down from Norway, raided the coastlines of France, laid siege to the city of Paris, and for his effort was made the first Duke of Normandy. His real name was Hrolf Ganger, and he may have been the greatest Viking who ever lived. Nobody knows exactly where Rollo came from. According to the ancient historian Dudo of St. Quentin, Rollo was Danish and led a group of Norwegian and Danish mercenaries. They went on expeditions to Scotland, Ireland, and England, then became rich through plundering. If the Icelandic sagas are to be believed, Rollo was the son of Count Ragnalf Eysteinsson, and he was so big and strong that no horse could carry him. Rollo besieged Paris sometime between 885 and 887. In the year 918, King Charles the Simple gave Rollo lands within the kingdom of West Francia, and this is the most interesting part of the story. Once Rollo was given these lands, he settled them officially. He adopted Christianity, his Viking comrades farmed the land, and they became the people known as the Normans. Normandy was the land given to the Vikings by France so they would stop murdering them. Rollo went on to have many children, and his descendants would go on to become members of royal houses all throughout Europe. Queen Cartimandua. Cartimandua was queen of the Brigantes in the 1st century AD. She ruled as a powerful Celtic leader in Britain from between the years 43 and 69 AD. The Brigantes are not a very well-known people. They were a group of Celtic citizens living across northern England around what is Yorkshire today. In the days of tribal Britain, theirs was the biggest. Queen Cartimandua had the misfortune of coming into power right at the time the Romans invaded. Most of what we know about her comes not from British sources, but from the Roman historian Tacitus. He described her as a strong and influential leader and said she made several deals with the Romans to keep her position of power. But in the year 51 AD, things took a dangerous turn. The British king of the Katuvilauni tribe, Caratacus, was leading a resistance against the Romans. He launched successful attacks and was defeated, then sought sanctuary with the Brigantes. This could have been bad for the queen, but she had her own power in mind. She realized how big a force Rome was and just how dangerous they were. So when King Caratacus came for her help, she put him in chains and handed him straight over to the Romans. This was a double-edged sword because it earned her favor with the invaders, but made her unpopular with the Celts, her own people. The Celts became so furious by many of the moves she made to secure her power that they rebelled against her. The Celts were squashed by the Romans during the rebellion, but the queen managed to slip away to a Roman fort at Deva, and her ultimate end is unknown. Would you rather marry a king or a queen, or be the greatest fighter in the world? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. William Walker. William Walker did not begin his life as any kind of leader. He was a small man, no more than 5 feet, and he weighed only about 120 pounds. Walker did not look like a military man or a brave adventurer, but the Tennessee-born native would grow to be one of the most successful Americans in the 19th century. He believed it was the destiny of the United States of America to stretch down into Mexico and claim all of Central America. The issue for William was that he had no real power. What he did have was money. He had enough money that in the 1850s, he purchased a private army and invaded Mexico twice. When Mexico turned out to be way too big to conquer, William Walker took his private army to Nicaragua and he declared himself as the president. During this time, Nicaragua was in the midst of a civil war. One of the fighting parties, the Liberals, agreed to grant William Walker colonist status and give him land grants if he could help defeat the Conservatives. After a bit of heavy fighting, Walker and his mercenaries took the fortress at Granada and beat back the Conservatives. He then made himself the head of the Nicaraguan military, chased the president out of the country, and declared himself the ruler in 1856. Even the U.S. president of the time, Franklin Pierce, recognized Walker as the leader of the country. The first thing William Walker did as president was make the national language English and legalize slavery. This insanity went on until September 12th of 1860, when Walker was captured by Hondurans and executed by firing squad. Empress Carlota of Mexico. Empress Carlota of Mexico was born in Belgium on June 7th of 1840 and was known originally as Princess Charlotte. She was the daughter of Leopold I, King of Belgium. She was also the first cousin of Queen Victoria, and oddly enough, the cousin of Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, as well. When she was only 16, Charlotte met Emperor Maximilian, who was in his mid-20s at the time. You may not be surprised to hear this, but Maximilian was also Charlotte's cousin. The princess married the emperor in 1857. They lived in Italy but fled in 1859 when the Italian War for Freedom had begun. Around this time, Napoleon III was busy trying to conquer Mexico. The idea was to impose a monarchy in Mexico that would answer directly to France. The man for the job was Emperor Maximilian and his wife, who changed her name to the Spanish Carlota just before they arrived in Mexico in 1864. Immediately, Maximilian and Carlota were proclaimed the Emperor and Empress of Mexico. However, France was losing the war. They were already being beaten by the United States. Nationalism was on the rise, and there was simply no room for a monarchy in Mexico. For a second, Carlota ruled one of the greatest empires in the world. But after the American Civil War was over, the U.S. backed Mexico against France, and that was the end of any monarchy in the country. Napoleon withdrew his troops, and Maximilian refused to leave. On June 19, 1867, he was captured and executed. Carlota was whisked back to Belgium, where she lived in seclusion for the next 60 years of her life, reportedly going completely insane. She passed away on January 19, 1927, at the ripe old age of 86. King David I. King David I of Scotland was born in the year 1084, and while there have been quite a lot of powerful Scottish rulers, David I was the only one who fundamentally transformed Scotland. He laid down the very foundations for what would become Scottish territory. His father was Malcolm III and his mother was Queen Margaret, who became a saint after she died. David's uncle, Donald III, took the throne when David's father died. David wouldn't get it back until 1124 with help from King Henry I of England. But once David was in power, he began changing the country forever. One of the most important things he did was build. He commissioned many monasteries across Scotland and encouraged a change in the way the local people worshipped God. He also founded Scotland's own currency and brought Anglo-Norman influences to Scotland through feudalism. In other words, he made Scotland modern. Then, at the Battle of Clitheroe in June of 1138, the Scottish beat the English and won their independence. The only place David failed was in northern Scotland, where the Norse still had a strong grip and refused to give up the Highlands. Queen Sindhyak. Queen Sindhyak is the most famous queen in Korean history. She was the ruler of Silla, one of the three main kingdoms of Korea in the 7th century. She was the 27th ruler of Silla, the very first ruling queen, and was monumentally important to the unification of Korea. Just like China and Japan, Korea wasn't always united under one banner. The Three Kingdoms period lasted from 57 BC until 668 AD, with the country split into three parts. Just decades after Queen Seondeok's death, Silla would defeat the other two kingdoms. This would finally bring the Korean peninsula under one flag for the first time in history. The only reason Sindhyak became queen was because of her father, King Jinpyong, who had been ruling for 40 years and only managed to have 3 daughters, but no sons. She was the first in line and the only qualified person to rule the Silla dynasty because of her pure blood. Starting in 634, she became the ruler of Silla. Much to the surprise of the people who didn't believe a woman could rule anything, she did a whole lot of good. She ushered in a renaissance of literature and art, one so powerful it had a profound impact on the kingdom. She used a level head to stop Silla from devolving into civil war and anarchy like the neighboring kingdoms were. The other two dynasties eventually ripped each other apart from the inside, and because of this, the Silla took over all of Korea. William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. His great-great-great-grandfather was Rollo the Viking, the legendary Viking raider who pillaged France in the 9th century. And while we call him William the Conqueror today, he was known most of his life as William the Bastard. He was born following an affair between Robert I of Normandy and a woman named Herleva of no renowned family. In France, William was only a duke. He invaded England in 1066 because he believed the English throne belonged to him through his ancestry. It was a fantastic invasion, and he defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings. This ushered in a new era in British history. After the great victory at Hastings, William marched his army into London, subdued the city, and crowned himself the first Norman King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey and thus ended the Anglo-Saxon period in England. French became the national language, and the Normans ruled the British Isles up until the Anglo-French War of 1202 to 1214. Thanks for watching! Who is your favorite ruler from history? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and come back soon for more videos on ancient history. See you later. Bye!